Welcome to another episode of Hardware Lens. Today we are going to be overclocking the Intel 10600K on the Gigabyte Z490 Aorus Ultra. This will serve as a guide for overclocking any 10th gen CPU on the Z490 platform using a Gigabyte BIOS. The techniques used in this video are my techniques for overclocking. There are multiple ways to do a CPU overclock. We're going to be featuring overclocking using the turbo ratio and a voltage offset. The nice thing about a voltage offset is it gives you a bump in voltage at idle and load so that you can continue to use the Intel power saving and downclocking functions when the CPU is not being heavily used while reducing instability. If you just go for a straight fixed V-core overclock and you leave things like speed step enabled, you might run into some instability when the CPU is not under load. So the first thing I do when I start overclocking is I install Windows. Before I start overclocking, let me clarify. So I set everything to stock. I set the RAM speed very low, very conservative settings. You don't want to have any instability when you're installing Windows. It's the first thing I do, install Windows. Then I install all the drivers for chipset, the LAN, audio, and of course the GPU. Then after that, download Google Chrome, and then I install Hardware Info 64 and Prime 95. Okay, so now that we have all of our software installed, the first thing I like to do is go into the BIOS and make sure that Smart Fan is set up how we need it to be. So for that we go to CPU OPT because that's where our water block is plugged in, and I have that set to full speed because it doesn't really make much of a noise difference. Some of the case fans are set on a temperature profile based on the CPU. That should be good enough. Then after that's done, what I do is I go and I make sure I set a baseline for everything, a good place to start, and save a profile. So what I do with that is I leave the CPU upgrade to default. We don't need to mess with that. Base clock, I lock that at 100. PCI Express, lock that at 100. Enhanced multi-core performance, that's a Gigabyte option. It applies the highest turbo ratio to all the cores, and that's something that we're going to want to do. I leave the CPU clock ratio at auto. I'll explain why later. We set the ring ratio low. We're going to overclock the ring bus after we get our max CPU overclock, because if you go too high with the ring ratio, it'll affect the CPU overclock, and we want to get as high of a CPU overclock as we can. We leave the IGP at auto because we're not going to mess with that, and I don't typically use an AVX offset since AVX is pretty widely used now. I set the memory speed to 3000, very low speed, just so we don't have to worry about memory affecting our stability at this point. And I set the timings at the default timings for the DDR4 4400 speed, which this memory kit is rated for. We'll be messing with that later on once we overclock the RAM, but we don't do that until the CPU overclock is done. For voltage, I use adaptive V-core because that makes the CPU behave as close to stock as possible. It behaves like a stock CPU, but it just overclocks higher. You still get the turbo boost and all of that, but the only difference is I've disabled the time limits and the power limits on turbo boost, so it'll run max boost for forever. And we're going to control the voltage there. We're going to give it an offset as we need. Right now we have it set to 0 for our initial baseline. We don't want to, every motherboard's different. It's going to give it a little bit more, a little bit less voltage, and we don't want to damage anything. We want to make sure we know exactly how much over voltage it's going to give us. I've seen you can set this to something that looks reasonable, and then it'll be at 1.5 volts when you boot it up, and you definitely don't want that. So we're gonna leave base clock adaptive voltage off since we're not messing with the base clock. CPU graphics voltage, I have that set at 1.2. That's the default. DRAM voltage is 1.45. That's default, I think, for these kits. And that's a perfectly safe voltage for B die, which we're running here. VCCIO and the system agent voltage, we're going to leave at 1.25 for now. We can go as high as 1.35, and higher than that, you're kind of gambling a little bit. So we're going to max that out at 1.35, but we shouldn't need to mess with that until we start playing with the RAM. And these voltages down here really only apply for preventing cold bugs with liquid nitrogen, so that's not something we're concerned with here. The advanced voltages, we're not going to mess with that. The only thing here that's worth noting is the switch rate for the voltage regulator, and Gigabyte maxes that out at 500 kilohertz, so we can't really go any higher than that. Higher settings can sometimes give you better transient response. I found with this board, turbo is a good setting to use for load line, so we're going to leave that there. And then let's go into advanced CPU settings, and I'll explain how we're going to do this overclock. Okay, so we're going to leave this at auto over temperature protection. That's fine. Hyper-threading, we'll leave that on. We're going to make sure all of our cores are enabled, and we'll leave all these default settings. A lot of people like to disable them for overclocking, and that's one way to do it. But we're gonna keep this CPU behaving as close to stock as we can while getting the most overclock out of it. This is a Gigabyte setting again. It says to enable for mobile SKUs, so we're going to disable it. We're going to leave Turbo Boost on because we're going to use that to overclock. And we're going to enable flex ratio override so that we can tweak that. And these settings, we're going to disable these two. Okay, so we're going to start out with a multiplier of 48, so that's going to give us 4.8 gigahertz. And we're going to overclock this CPU by changing the turbo ratio, since we have the motherboard forcing the max turbo ratio. Without a time limit or power limit, we're gonna be able to sustain this overclock using the turbo ratio. And since we have all of the default power saving enabled, what that's going to mean is when the CPU is not under load, it's still going to downclock, and it's going to lower the voltage, and we think that'll help with longevity and temps and power consumption. There's no need to have the CPU running at max voltage all the time, even when you're not doing anything with it. That's one of the advantages of using the adaptive overclock, adaptive vCore overclock here. That's why I like to do it this way, because you get those benefits, especially since this PC is going up for sale. It's going to somebody else. We want to make sure that it lasts as long as possible and it's safe for daily use. Okay, so once we have that set, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save a profile. That's going to be our pre-OC profile, and that means anytime we have to clear the CMOS or we get an unstable overclock and we can't post, we can clear the CMOS and we can load this profile back up, and we have somewhere to start from again that we don't have to mess with all those settings all over again. Okay, so now that we have that set, we're going to start with 4.8. We're going to boot into Windows, and we're going to run some Prime 95. We'll see what our temps and voltage looks like, and that'll give us a baseline. Obviously, we're going to want to try and get a much better overclock than that. But let's reboot here and see how everything looks. Okay, so now we're booted into Windows. Had no trouble getting in at 4.8 as we expected. So we can see here, you can look at CPU-Z, you can see the core voltage is way down, and CPU is downclocking, so it's behaving like it should. It's behaving like normal right now, like a stock CPU would, but the only difference is you can see it boosts up to 4.8. That's already an overclock for the 10600K. The all-core max boost frequency is 4.5 and single core is 4.8, so we're technically already overclocked. Now let's come into Hardware Info 64, and we can see we've got two different readings here. We've got VR out and we've got vCore. What we're going to really be looking at is the VR out reading. That's a more accurate measurement of what the CPU is actually seeing. I'm not going to get into the technical details of it, but it's a more accurate reading than vCore. It doesn't have as much resistance between the reading or something like that, so it's a more accurate reading of what the CPU is actually seeing. So that tells us that well, let's before we do that, let's get Prime 95 running for a few minutes here. So we'll run with we'll disable AVX for now. We don't want the CPU to thermal throttle with AVX. Prime 95 is an insane amount of stress on the CPU, more than anything else that you'll run with AVX enabled. There's nothing that will make the CPU run that hot in normal use. So we're gonna run with it disabled for now. We'll test with it enabled later on. But okay, so now it's running, and we can see that with the 0 offset, we're getting a 1.27 volt reading at the CPU. vCore is showing about 1.309, but again, we're going to trust the 1.275. That should be a much more accurate reading. Software reading is showing that we're pulling about 90 amps right now. MOSFETs are nice and cool. As expected, it's a 12-phase VRM with 60 amp power stages. It's more than enough to handle a 6-core CPU. And we'll take a look at our CPU temps. So CPU is running nice and cool. Let's shut this off for a minute. Let's run AVX for just a little bit. Get an idea of what the heat is like with AVX compared. So with AVX on, we've got, well, it looks like about 10 degrees more. See what current looks like. And we're pulling 120 amps versus the 90 that we were seeing before. MOSFETs are still ice cold. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about MOSFET temps until we start hitting about 100 C, which we're not going to come anywhere near. Okay. So we'll go ahead and shut this down. And we'll see with this voltage, we'll see how high we can get the frequency and how high we can boot into Windows with what frequency. So we'll try 4.8 now. Might as well try 5.1. Let's see that. Okay, so we're back in the BIOS now. We're going to go ahead and change the CPU clock ratio. We're going to see if we can get into Windows at 5.1. We're not going to do anything with the voltage because we're doing an adaptive vCore, and when we change the turbo frequency, it might send the CPU more voltage, so we definitely don't want to mess with that yet until we see what voltage it's going to send the CPU in auto. Alright, so we'll go down here and try 5.1. Okay, so we've got a good post. Debug codes are done. And we just had a crash. Okay. So we'll try 4. We'll try 5. We'll see what happens at 5. It's probably going to need more voltage. Alright, there's 5. Let's try again. Good post again. Alright, so we made it into Windows that time. Let's take a look at our readings. Whoops. No, we don't need NVIDIA control panel. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to look for is the voltage. I'm going to see if that's changed. Doesn't look like that's changed a whole lot. Okay, let's fire up Prime and probably going to crash. See what it does under load. So we got 1.27 under load, so that hasn't really changed. 1.309, so yep, we're exactly the same under load. Okay, so let's try again with 5.1. Let's give it a little more voltage and see how high we can get into Windows. So since this is a Skylake based microarchitecture, I'm really not concerned with voltage under 1.4. Anything under 1.4 should be totally fine with this microarchitecture. I've had a CPU that's been running for over 4 years now at 1.47 volts. I know that's really high, but it's been fine. I haven't had any degradation with it, so I'm not going to be concerned with anything under 1.4. But since this is going to somebody else, it's not going to be my PC. We're going to be a little bit more conservative, so we won't go too much higher than 1.4. Alright, so the first thing we'll do, we'll give it a little bit more of an offset. So we're at 1.27 just about. Now let's try 0.05. Let's see what that gets us. And we'll see if we can get in at 51. Okay. Alright, we've got a good post once again. And we've made it further than last time. Let's see how it looks. Alright, so we got VR out 1.347. So we got quite a bit more voltage now. Still plenty safe. Let's see. Okay, so we go down to 1.32 under load. That's why I like the turbo V-core setting. We get a little bit of V-droop, but not too bad where we have to really bring the idle voltage too high. I don't want that. And this is a very strong VRM, so I think it can handle it just fine. Okay, so now that we've got more voltage and we got into Windows at 5.1, let's see the highest speed we can get into Windows at this voltage. So we'll try 5.2. Typically the way I overclock is I like to set the voltage to my personal safe limit, see how high I can get the frequency to boot into Windows, and then I run Prime and I just bring the frequency back down little by little to increase stability. I find I go from voltage down. Oh, we had a crash that time. I forgot to hit delete. So it's definitely a little bit unstable here. Probably going to need a little bit more voltage then. Let's try 0.065. Okay, we'll try 52. My 10900K maxed out at 52 stable, so we'll see what the 10600K does. We'll see if it does any better. It's going to be less heat, so maybe it'll be better, but it's also potentially worse bin silicon, so that might have some effect. And of course, you never really know what you're getting with the silicon lottery. Sometimes it's just luck. And we've got a good post once again. Oh, okay, we just crashed. Might be hitting our wall. Let's try 0.07. Good post. Okay, we don't need to do any of this. So we're just going to load Windows. It's going to restart. Oh, crashed again. Really doesn't want to do 5.2. All right. Well, let's try a little bit more. Eventually we're going to have to stop here. Surprised. I thought we'd be able to get 5.2 at least to boot. Oh, almost. Okay, so I'm going to bring the frequency down to 5.1 again, and we'll take a look at what our voltage is. We might be at the limit here for vCore, so take a look at that before we go any higher. And in fact, I'm going to bring this, well, we'll leave it there. No, you know what? I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to bring it down to 0.075. No, 0.07. Okay, and we'll bring that turbo ratio down again. And Windows is going to think something's broken. Okay. Once again. So we're going to get a restart here. Alright. Let's see how it looks. Well, this is one fast PC. .368. Okay, so not too bad. Still very safe. 1.4 idle is a good thing to look for. 1.375 under load. Okay, let's see what we've got for load. We got 1.34 loaded. Okay. Alright, so we can go higher on the voltage. Let's try a +1 offset, see if we can get 5.2. One. Okay, let's try that. Good post. And same crash. Let's see what it's going to take. Now there's a point when you overclock and you start hitting a wall where you need an exponentially higher amount of voltage for a very small increase in frequency, and it looks like that's what's happening here. Since we were very safe before, let's try 0.125 and see where that takes us. From the looks of this, I certainly don't think we're going to get, if we do get 5.2, we're certainly not going to get any higher with any stability. I don't consider a PC stable until it runs prime overnight. That's just me. I don't like dealing with crashes. Okay, well, we've crashed again, same point. So it needs more. Give it a little bit more. Try 0.14. Then I'm going to want to take a look at that. See what number we're getting here. Alright, startup repair is going to run again. Okay, same crash once again. Alright, well, we'll go back down to 5.1 and we'll see what our voltage looks like. Okay, good post. Let's take a look at the voltage. Okay, 1.43. Let's run prime real quick here. That's safe for a little while, but we're not going to keep that voltage for long. So 1.4. Okay, so this is the limit here. I wouldn't, since I'm giving this, since this PC is going to be going to someone else, I won't go any higher than that with voltage. You know, I don't. Some people tend to get a little nervous once we go above 1.4 or 1.45. If it was my personal PC, I'd probably go a little bit higher. You know, I'm not really concerned with making something that's going to last for 20 years. If it lasts only 15 or 18 years instead of 20, I really don't care. You know, the CPU is going to be outdated long before it degrades. So, from my experience with Skylake architecture. Alright, so we'll bring that voltage back down. Doesn't look like we're going to get 5.2, unfortunately. Look at our temps. Temps are probably pretty high. Yep, very high. Okay. So yeah, that's not something that we want continuously here, for sure. And again, we had AVX on for that, so that's the reason for the extreme temperatures. There's nothing you'll ever do that will bring the CPU temp that high. Even if you are running an application with AVX, because Prime 95 with AVX is just torture for the CPU. That's why they call it a torture test. Okay, so what we're going to try now is we're going to go back down to, well, one last thing I'm going to do here. Every now and then you hear about, when you overclock, you hear about some CPUs or motherboards not liking a certain multiplier. So just before we give up on this, we're going to go to 53 and we'll see if that gets into Windows, but I really doubt it. Just to see, in case there's some problem with the 52 multiplier. But I really don't think so. But we'll try. And then we'll downclock everything. And just to be safe here, we'll lower that voltage a little bit. Let's go to 0.125. So even if we did get 52 or 53 stable, it's probably not worth it. We need so much more voltage and we're going to create so much more heat just for that extra 100 megahertz. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We did post though at 53 and we've got the same crash again. Alright, so it looks like 51 is where it's going to be. I'm sure we'll be able to get it stable. We were able to get into Windows with a pretty low voltage, so we have a lot of headroom there. So I think we'll be able to get this overnight Prime 95 stable. And then once we do that, we'll overclock the ring bus a little bit. We'll see how high we can get that to go. Once we find our max CPU overclock, core overclock, and ring overclock, then we'll start overclocking the RAM. And we'll see what this board can do. I know this Z490 Aorus Ultra that we're using here has been very good for RAM overclocking, so I'm excited to see what kind of results that gives us. Okay, so we're going to bring this back down to 51. And we'll bring our vCore back to about 0.075. Because I know we got into Windows at that last time, I believe. So we'll try that. Make sure we can get into Windows there, and then we'll start running Prime. And we'll let that run overnight, at least 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours. If it crashes before then, we'll bump the voltage up a notch, run it again, and I won't be satisfied until it runs overnight, at least 12 to 24 hours, like I said. Whoever gets this PC is not going to have any issues with instability. You know, if you overclock the right way, it's just as stable as running a stock PC. There's no need to fear overclocking. Okay. And we'll check our VR out. So 1.37. We'll turn AVX off. We don't want the CPU. And the reason, I'll explain that a little more. The reason I turn AVX off is because if our CPU throttles because of the heat and downclocks, it's actually understressing the CPU. And it might run longer on Prime than it would if it didn't throttle and downclock. So you actually won't get as good of a stress test if you leave AVX on and you're thermal throttling. So we'll run it with AVX for a little while after we get a stable overclock, just to see how it does and make sure it's safe. But we're not going to run it overnight with AVX because it may give us a false indication of stability. Okay, so that's set to run. Alright, so we've got a load voltage of 1.34, 1.345. We got a little bit of V droop, so we went from 1.374 down to 1.345, which is fine. That's a pretty minimal amount of V droop. And we're pulling 100 amps through the CPU right now. The 10900K that we ran pulls about double that at 5.2, and it runs quite hot. Runs about 10 degrees hotter than this. $150 watts. Alright, so we'll leave this running. And again, we're looking for 12 to 24 hours of runtime on Prime to validate that this is stable. And if we do get 12 to 25 at this voltage, then we didn't. We've got a crash. But if we did, then we would lower the voltage and see what the minimum voltage we needed for that overclock was. So it just crashed. So we're gonna have to bump it up a little bit more. Okay, so 0.075, we'll try well, since we had a crash that early on, we'll try just 0.1. And hopefully we get 5.1. It's not guaranteed, but I think we will. We've got some headroom here. So now that we know that 1.345 was not enough voltage, we know we need more than that. We're not going to waste any time trying to go lower than that, obviously, because it's not going to help. It won't be stable. Okay. So 1.398, so we're about 1.4 idle V-core, which again is fine. It's really what you want to worry about. In terms of CPU lifespan, is your load voltages. You're not going to, unless you just outright kill a CPU by running 1.5 or 1.6 volts through it at idle, you're not going to degrade it significantly with the idle voltage. It's not going to really matter. What's going to matter is the load voltage, which we've come up from 1.44 about 1.45. Now we're at 1.37. So we're going to see how this does now. Again, looking at for 12 to 24 hours here. Let's take a look at our temps. Okay, so we're in the 90s. That's fine for prime. I'm not concerned with 90s. I wouldn't want to be in the hundreds. These CPUs run hot, but we're in the 80s and 90s and low 90s. That's okay. And if you get concerned with temperatures, you can lower the TJ max. Its default is at 105. We can lower it to 95, and then the CPU will downclock when it hits that temperature automatically. But hopefully it'll be stable at this voltage. VRM's nice and cold, 43. Okay, so prime ran for about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, and then we had another crash, and the temps were starting to creep up above 95. So I don't really want to push more voltage into the CPU just because of the temps we're running, and we're running a good cooler. It's the Arctic cooling freezer too, but it's we're still hitting the temp limit that I like to see. So we're gonna try and go down to 5 gigahertz is still a respectable overclock. And again, since this isn't going to be my PC, we want to be very safe. So we'll try 5 and we'll run prime again. Okay, so we've been running prime 95 now for just over 15 hours, and everything is still good. We're still error free here. So temps are pretty high. This is the limit for me. I wouldn't, we don't really have any thermal headroom to push the voltage any higher, so it doesn't look like we're going to get 5.1. We're at 5.0. Pay attention to the average numbers here. That's on average what we've been running. For some reason, Core 1 is running much cooler than the others. Not really sure why that is. If we come down here, we'll take a look at the MOSFET temps. They maxed out at 49. Still very, very cold, as expected. VRM is way overkill for a 6-core CPU. And voltage is right around 1.368. Okay, so that's 5.0 gigahertz. That looks to be our max stable overclock here for 24/7 use. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into BIOS and we're going to increase the ring ratio and see how high we can get that. We're going to looking for the same stability. We're going to run prime again for at least 12 to 24 hours. Okay, so we'll let's try a ring ratio of 5. Let's see if we can max our CPU overclock. I don't think we will be able to, but we'll try it anyway. Oh, but before we do that, actually, let's go back and set this to 43 again. But before we do that, I'm going to save a profile. Now that we have our stable overclock, we want to make sure we save that so we don't Have to go back and reset everything. So that's 5 gigahertz, and let's name it stable. Okay, so now that we've got that set, we'll go back in here and we'll change our ring ratio to 5.0. Okay, so I'm not sure if you caught it in the last video, but we had a little bit of a mistake with the ring ratio. If you looked in hardware info, we were running a 50 ring ratio, but it was only showing 47. And we caught that later on in the test. And the reason for that is if you go to advanced CPU settings, you'll see the ring to core offset. And we had that enabled. What that will do is it'll automatically reduce the ring ratio by 3 from the CPU core ratio. And that's why it was giving us a 47 instead of a 50. So we went ahead and disabled that. And then we tested 50, and it crashed right away. So 50 is no good. And then we ran 49, and it crashed after 20 minutes. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to try 48, and we're going to set it up to run stress test again. Okay, so we got Prime running again here at 48 ring ratio. We just started it, and you can see now that it's correct. So it's that was the issue there while we were seeing 47. So just make sure you disable that setting if you're overclocking the uncore. Alright, so we'll let... Okay, well, we're here at 8 hours, 39 minutes, and we're completely frozen. So the 48X uncore multiplier was not stable. That's why we test for so long, because after 8 hours, everything looked fine, but now it's frozen. So we're going to go back down to 47. We know 47 is stable because before we caught our mistake, before we had it running for over 12 hours without any issues. So we're going to go down to 47. We're going to lock it there, and we're going to call that complete for our CPU overclock. So we've got 5 gigahertz and 47 for the uncore or cache ratio. So that's pretty good. That's quite a bit higher than stock for the 10600K. So we think that's a nice overclock. Should provide a substantial performance boost compared to a stock 10600K. And this guide will serve as a good overview for how to overclock any 10th gen Z490 CPU on a Gigabyte BIOS. The next video, we're going to take the same PC and we're going to go over the RAM overclocking. We're going to see just how high we can get the RAM, Samsung B-Die RAM on the Gigabyte Z490 Aorus Ultra. Okay, guys, before we end this video, I just want to note one thing here. If you take a look at the temps here in hardware info, we're running Prime again under the same settings, but the temps are a little bit lower this time. All we did was reseated the CPU water block, so we took it off, cleaned off the thermal paste, reapplied, and reseated it. And we've got some temps are a few degrees cooler, probably about 5 degrees on average so far. So yeah, temps did look a little bit high for the voltage we're seeing, especially being only a 10600K. The temps were about what I see on my 10900K, but now they're about 5 degrees lower than that. So this is more in line with what I would expect for a 10900K. We're gonna leave the overclock here at 5 gigahertz. It just doesn't seem worth it to go to 5.1. Seems like we're gonna need a whole lot more voltage just for that extra 100 megahertz, and it's just unnecessary, in my opinion. And one thing that we didn't mention before that I just wanted to add before we end this video is we did run overnight for another 12 hours with AVX enabled, and it was stable. The only reason that we do that, of course, is we want to make sure that we have stability even with AVX, because many programs today do use AVX instructions, so we want to make sure that it's stable with AVX as well. But we don't do that first because we don't want the CPU to downclock during our initial overclock and give us a false sense of stability. Okay, so that's the end of our 10th Gen Z490 Gigabyte overclock guide. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.